Thank you all for being part of this. This is a more bang for the buck kind of conversation, and it's a how can we get more results from the money that we're spending on education. And I want to just suggest to you that the education financing system of American schools, K-12, has basically missed both of the two large boats that have sailed in education reform in this country over the last 25 years. Ever since the Coleman Report, we've begun to judge schools by their outcomes, their results, not by their inputs, their promises, or their claims. And yet, our funding system, by and large, still funds inputs, promises, programs, claims, not results. I want to suggest that the funding system has never caught up with our policy desire to judge schools and districts by the effectiveness and the results that they produce for kids. The other large change of the past 25 years is that American kids, to a huge extent, now have choices among schools, all kinds of different choices. By and large, the money doesn't accompany the kids to the school. By and large, the money does not accompany the kids to the school. Some of the money goes with them, some of the money doesn't. The state money goes, the district money doesn't, the federal money never. The federal money goes to the district under a complicated formula that says which schools it has to go to, more or less regardless of which kids decided to leave that school and go to a different school because it might offer better education. So I want to suggest that the financing system hasn't caught up with the idea of choice, and the financing system hasn't caught up with the idea of outcomes. I suggest, here's my conclusion for this panel, but also probably for the last 50 years of my life, would like to suggest to policymakers in states that you fix this, please. It's overdue, it's a problem, and the reforms that we are trying so hard to make happen are never going to fully happen unless the money accompanies the reforms. And today it largely does not. So with that by way of backdrop, we're going to go in the order that is on your program. We're going to start with Tom, and then we're going to go right on down the row here with Senator Galvano, and I assume that we're going to find Greg at some point, and in between Ian from the Federal Reserve in San Francisco. They're going to explain their take on this problem and how it can be solved. Take it away, Tom Vander Ark.
Thank you, Checker. I'm going to highlight two white papers that we wrote with the Foundation for Excellence in Education. My co-author, Carrie Schneider, is over here, but John Bailey and Carrie and I wrote two relevant papers, and I'll spend a minute on each. The first one suggested that the funding that states provide to schools should have four characteristics. It should be weighted, meaning it should reflect the challenge, the risk factors that individual students bring to a school or a provider. Two, it should be flexible, so it should not come with all the input requirements that Checker mentioned. Three, as Checker noted, it should be portable. It should follow that student to the best possible learning experience, and Senator and I were talking about how that might work in Virginia. And finally, it should be, at least in part, performance-based. So that might be like Florida Virtual gets half the money up front and half based on completion. So it's completion-oriented, it's not technically performance-based, but it at least creates an incentive that students finish the course. In some states, there's a count day at the beginning of the year, and that actually creates an incentive to push kids out of school. All right, so we at least suggest that states take away those disincentives for performance. So state funding should be weighted, portable, flexible, and performance-based. The second paper that I'd like to highlight is called, it suggests that states can use prizes and pull mechanisms to boost achievement. There's a picture of it up there. I posted a blog about 2 hours ago on gettingsmart.com, and it lists 10 ways that states can use prizes and pull mechanisms. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that for more detail. Let me just highlight a couple different ways that rather than mandating are attempting to mandate innovation, states can use prizes and incentives to produce better schools. The first is market development strategies. The most common worldwide example of this is, it's called advanced market commitments. It was used in Africa. Bill Clinton actually went around Africa and gathered commitments for the use of AZT, and then he took it to GlaxoSmithKline, negotiated a lower price, and it opened up this brand new gigantic market. And so that was just aggregating demand for a product. And we don't do that very well in education. We're so decentralized that there's not demand aggregation that signals to investors and to companies to build new products. So Karen Cater, who recently left government to take on Digital Promise, is an example of a nonprofit. She's gathered about 50 school districts around the country, and they're just creating demand aggregation that can signal to the market where investment should be placed. So that's an example of market development. States can also use things like social impact bonds to fund preschool experiments, juvenile justice, dropout recovery. So there's lots of examples of market development. Second would be fast-track policy implementation. An example of that would be an innovation zone. New York City set up a giant I-zone. Many states are thinking about innovation zones where you create room for new schools, new measurement systems. The third category would be prizes. These are inducement prizes where you pay for performance. An example is a prize that I ran for the Hewlett Foundation last year called the Automated Student Assessment Prize. We gave out a $100,000 prize twice for people that could build an algorithm to score student essays as well as teachers. So that's paying for performance for particular innovations. You could do design challenges. The foundation, our host, the Foundation for Excellence in Education, is running a prize right now called the School Info Challenge, and it's a design prize for people that have developed state school report cards that much more efficiently share data with parents. And Carrie has been out leading voting on the finalists. There's still a stand out there, right, where you can vote to give the prize to the best design. There's also data challenges. There's app challenges. When Joel was in New York, they ran a Gap app challenge that got mobile app developers to develop lots of cool apps for kids in New York City. The last pull mechanism that I'll describe are short cycle trials. So this is an example of demand aggregation. It takes a group of schools that agree to try new tools and strategies, and then provide really quick cycle feedback so that these developers can engage in iterative development. Chicago has Leap Innovations, which is a new nonprofit that's running these short cycle trials, and then the New York City Department of Education is running some. They're actually highlighting the winners of a round in December. So in short, states can use prizes and pull mechanisms, incentives, creatively to encourage innovation rather than attempting to mandate it.
Thank you very much. There's seats up front and in the middle for folks in the back who might like to sit down. If you're just sampling, then you can stay standing. One quick question, Tom, before we move on to Florida. Innovation zones. I'll hone in on that for just a second. I understand the sort of deregulatory aspect of an innovation zone, but what's the funding aspect of an innovation zone?
Yeah, it's a great question. So two-part answer. One is it would be best executed alongside a portable funding mechanism so that the money followed the child, because you'd want to avoid double funding this as much as possible. But the second part of the answer is it would work best if combined with new school grants. Every state, I think, ought to look at the Next Generation Learning Challenge grants, NGLC. Cities have begun offering NGLC grants, Washington, D.C., Denver, Chicago, New Orleans. I think states, particularly smaller states, could run a school, a grant program like this to encourage innovation, and then these new schools could reside in an innovation zone, particularly if they're going to pilot a new measurement system. So they could be given a pass, for example, on at least part of a measurement system. So combining these
Okay.
mechanisms could be quite useful.
Good, thank you. Senator Bill, what are you doing in Florida?
You know, in doing the budget, which is really our only constitutional requirement in the state of Florida, we are constantly asked to be good stewards, to be efficient, to be effective. People are telling us that these are our tax dollars, we want you to use them wisely, and we want results. However, that's not true in education. In education, we are judged by the amount of money we put into the system. Very rarely, outside of a room like this, are we asked, are you good stewards? Has it been effective? Has it been efficient? Instead, we're asked, what is the total funding per student? Has it increased? And what are you spending as a whole? And it goes beyond that even. It's not just a question or a political campaign season type of issue. We actually get sued. We get sued if the belief is out there that we have not funded at a certain level. We're not sued because we didn't achieve goals. We don't get sued because efficiency hasn't been achieved. We get sued solely on the idea that we have not funded education at a certain level compared to other states. And that has to change first before we can really go into a world in education at a lawmaker's level that achieves outcomes and ties it directly to funding.
Let me interrupt with a question. Do you happen to know what the Florida constitutional provision is for school funding? Every state constitution has one, like necessary and sufficient or fully adequate or something like that.
Yes, and that's basically it. You know, it's adequate funding for education.
And that's what you get sued under, is
Correct.
that you didn't do that.
Right, it's
Okay.
the adequacy.
Okay.
And in Florida, for example, right now, we have an adequacy lawsuit that is pending. And so, you know, against that backdrop, Florida has been making serious, substantial steps to more performance-based funding. In fact, we began years ago under the leadership of Governor Jeb Bush at the time, and then have continued to build along the way, with a good number of fights along the way too, as we move towards that model. In the last couple of years, I think we were very aggressive in terms of performance-based funding, not just in K-12, but in the college system, and then ultimately in the university system, where we really put skin in the game for the universities and established metrics through the Board of Governors. But we are spending right now probably $270 million directly tied to performance-based funding, and this is in a few areas, and I'll just touch on them briefly. $118 million for students passing high school acceleration exams, and this in turn has resulted in broader and more course offerings. Is that feedback from me?
I don't think so. It's just the
It's the
speaker.
plaintiffs.
It's the plaintiffs. You are being listened to all over
Yeah,
Florida.
right. This could end up as an exhibit. And also, with regard to school grades, $107 million. And then we've been very aggressive in career and professional education, what we call the CAPE Act in Florida, leading to college preparedness as well as industry certifications. And again, the net result has been that there is more choice within the system for the students and parents and stakeholders, and we are seeing returns. And we are going to continue along that path in the state of Florida, despite some of the obstacles that we have, because as I said when I started, ultimately, as a lawmaker, I have to be responsible for good stewardship of tax dollars.
So say another word about the performance funding mechanism. Is it like Is it like an extra award for every kid that passes or graduates or so forth?
Yes, based on third-party exams, whether it's on the accelerated course exams or industry certification type of exams, and it's funded based on that mechanism.
After the fact?
Yes, so what you're having is the course offerings within the schools so that these exams can be passed and achieved, and it's after the fact, yes.
And then who gets the money? The district?
The district gets the money.
The district gets the money.
Right, and because it's after the fact, some of these dollars go back into offsetting cost for administering exams, offering the courses, but again, it's truly performance-based.
And how much money per person are we talking about? You gave some round numbers for the statewide total, but if you're a school and you get 27 students instead of 24 across this line, do you know how much money?
I don't know the exact figure per student. Maybe Senator.
You can look it up and come back and report it to us. What's the actual bounty that's attached to another student crossing the line? Good, we'll come back to this. And anybody with immediate access to Florida database can look it up in the meantime. And there are still seats up front if anybody would like to sit down from the back of the room. So Ian, take us out of the education space. How does the real world work?
I'm the wrong person to ask that question.
I know, you work for the Fed.
I work for the Fed. Who thinks it's a little bit weird that there's a Fed person at an education conference, right? A lot of people. So I just want to maybe just a couple minutes on why the Federal Reserve is interested in this topic and others like it. So we actually have a department at the Federal Reserve called the Community Development Department. And many of you may be familiar with the community development industry. It's actually a fairly sizable industry. It's about $1 billion a year, mostly private capital, mostly bank capital, that goes into rebuilding low-income places. So think affordable housing, community facilities, charter school facilities, others like it. From our perspective, rebuilding the physical spaces where poor people live is necessary, but ultimately insufficient to actually move the dial on the human capital outcomes that we care about the most. So education, of course, falls squarely in that category of human capital outcomes that we care about, particularly for low-income people of low opportunity. The problem is that this industry that we've built, which for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is a very sophisticated industry. Public-private partnerships, complicated capital stacks, subsidy leveraged significantly to attract billions of dollars of private capital. The problem is all of those tools have only really been used to build buildings. And we don't have equivalent tools in our financial toolbox to build people and to invest in kids. So what I would like to see happen is taking some of these tried and true mechanisms that work to build buildings and adapt them so that we can build better people. And what do I mean by this? And Checker asked me to spend a couple minutes on a non-education example. So I'm going to talk about a fairly obscure federal policy, which some of you may be familiar with, and I'll try to get through it quickly so I don't bore you to tears, called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, otherwise known as LIHTC. So the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit was created as part of the 1986 Tax Reform Act. And the goal of LIHTC at the time was to raise private sector investment in multifamily affordable housing. So when most people think about public housing, they think about Pruitt-Igoe. They think about these big towers and these big parks that are isolated from the rest of the city where poor people live. And it was mostly federally funded. This came out of the Great Society sort of initiative of the, beginning in the New Deal and continuing through the Great Society in 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. And ultimately, as we all know, that approach to building affordable housing for low-income people didn't work particularly well. So those programs went away, and in their place rose organically a network of very scrappy, very entrepreneurial housers. These were local nonprofits, local community development corporations, and others, foundations, who managed to cobble together sort of these disparate sources of funding to build housing for low-income people in their neighborhoods. And inevitably, that housing was very customized for that particular neighborhood, particular set of people, particular set of challenges. So it worked much, much better than these sort of command control, Washington-based housing projects that ultimately didn't prevail and didn't meet the needs of the people who lived in them. The problem was, and I think this is true of everything that we're talking about today, the problem was there was no financing mechanism to bring that innovation, that local innovation happening all over the country, to scale. So that's ultimately the challenge I think that we're all faced, is we all want innovation, we all want entrepreneurialism, but we have no way to scale it, because in a way those two ideas are almost in conflict, right? How do you scale something that's constantly changing? That's where light tech comes in. So the low-income housing tax credit is an investment tax credit that is awarded to the states. So it's about $8 billion a year in federal subsidy. Those credits are sold to affordable housing developers, are awarded to affordable housing developers who then sell them to corporations, banks, and others who have tax liability. So think of them as kind of tax coupons. So Goldman Sachs, for example, would buy these credits at a discount, reflecting sort of the risk that comes along with buying these credits, and I'll explain that in a second. They buy these credits and then use the credits to offset their tax liability for the next 10 years. The housing developer uses the money that they raise from selling the credits to reduce the overall cost of the project. So if the project was a $2 million project and they got $1 million worth of tax credits, that would reduce the total cost of the project to $1 million, which allows the developer to rent the project at a lower rate to tenants. So that's kind of how the mechanism works and how they get the rents down to a point where people can afford them. The trick, and what's interesting about this and relevant to this conversation today, is that there's an accountability piece of it that's baked in. And that is, for the next 15 years, that project has to stay affordable. If at any point it becomes unaffordable, if the rents go too high or the project falls into foreclosure, the tax credits that were bought by Goldman Sachs are recaptured by the IRS at full loss to the investor. So the investor is very, very careful about what projects they buy tax credits from, because if the project doesn't work out, then the investor is at risk. So there's accountability baked in. There's a federal, Joel Klein mentioned in the lunch today how federal, national standards are at odds because of political reasons. This is a case where the federal government set a standard for affordability and then awards local housing developers with the subsidy they need to build the housing that their local communities need. So we have innovation at scale. So the low-income housing tax credit is a great example of how we can actually pump significant amounts of subsidy into programs that are working. And I think there's an opportunity here, and I actually sort of wrote about this in a policy paper a couple years ago, to take that exact structure and adapt it for education. So what if, instead of awarding tax credits to housing developers, we awarded them to charter schools? And the charter schools would be held accountable for reducing the achievement gap of their students. So that the charters would get these awards of tax credits, they would sell them to investors, they would be held accountable to this achievement requirement, and they would use the money that they raised from selling the credits to pay for the wraparound programs that they know are necessary to enhance the curriculum of the kids in their school. And then fast forward 5 years or however long you want to run the program, you evaluate, did they in fact reduce the achievement gap? If so, then everything's fine. If not, then the investors in those tax credits those tax credits are reclaimed by the state or the federal government. So accountability, scaling innovation, taking a known quantity, a known program that works in one context and applying it to a different context, a human capital outcome as opposed to a real estate outcome. I feel like there's a lot of opportunity to take what we know works and adapt it slightly for education. And this is just one example of a larger category that we're going to get into a little bit later called pay for success. But I was asked to talk a little bit about a non-education example, and housing I think is a great place to start.
Could a state do this on its own? Your example started with the $8 billion federal investment.
Yes, so as long as there is a tax liability, so if the state has an income tax or a corporate tax, then absolutely. The reason that it works as well as it does at the federal government level, of course, is because all people and corporations have a fairly sizable tax liability at that level, but it could certainly work at the state level, it could work at the county level, it could even work at the city level.
I mean, the advantage of a tax expenditure is that it inevitably comes sort of after the fact. You have to you have to spend the money in order to get the credit. So it's not an upfront outlay on the part of, as so much of our school financing is.
Right.
Tom?
Can I just interject that it's also an interesting thought experiment to contemplate separating school facilities, ownership and management from school operation? And that I think cities could contemplate separating these, or perhaps a state could remove the ability for districts, or perhaps low-performing districts, from being taxing entities, and they could lose the ownership of their buildings. Their buildings could go into a trust, and that school operators could operate under a performance contract. I think that's a whole interesting line of
Absolutely,
of
and or the
conversation.
real estate cost could be picked up in a way such as Ian is describing with the housing cost,
Absolutely.
so that the real estate cost of the school doesn't
And
necessarily.
that would
Yeah.
also put, all public education operators on similar footing vis-à-vis facilities
I mean,
leasing.
including charters, for example, would be
right.
able to share in that as well. And we would get out of this pickle that so many places are in, where the district owns the buildings and the charters have to plead for them, or something like that. Fascinating. We'll come back to this. So from the great state of Utah, how are you getting more bang for your buck?
Thank you. Yeah, I'll tell you, I don't know if you've heard Utah's story. It's probably similar to some, but I think it's exaggerated because we have more children per taxpayer than any other state. We have a property tax.
They don't drink.
I'm telling you, that's all. I'm not even going to go there. Let me just tell you this, though. We have more children to educate with the taxpayer dollar. We have a very young state, so the average age of a taxpayer is in their 30s. Many states, those taxpayers are well in their 40s, even early 50s, and think about what your household income looks like at that time of your life versus when you're younger. So the tax contribution is less. You look at other states, and many states' engine for funding education is the property tax. Utah, as well as many western states, have federally owned land. Over 65% of the land in the state of Utah is federally owned, and you do not see a property tax or any kind of revenue derived from the land. That really handicaps a state like Utah. So when we look at public policy in regards to how we're going to deliver education, it really is the mother of necessity. We have to find ways to stretch dollars like few are tasked with. We know that we have at-risk kids living just somewhere in Utah right now. They're either lucky enough to be at home, they might be in a child care facility, they might be in a school district's preschool facility right now. And there are tests out there. There are ways that you can evaluate children, and the one's called the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test. And with a 95% certainty, you can determine that if a 3 or 4-year-old can only identify 300 vocabulary words, but the average for a 3 or 4-year-old is 1,200 words, that absent any intervention at all, you're going to have special education dollars that you're going to have to spend on that student once they enter our public schools. 97% of school-age children enter our schools in Utah, while we don't have a strong private school system in the state of Utah. So if I know that 95% that an at-risk child is going to need an individual education plan, and I know how much that individual education plan is because it's a uniform amount per child in the state of Utah of $7,000, you can quickly calculate the kind of additional cost that's going to come to the state of Utah to educate these at-risk children. The scary part for this child is that at the age of 3rd grade, if they're not out of that special education system and mainstream and now outside of an individual education plan, the odds that they will stay in special ed will go throughout their time K through 12. So we're looking at a very significant cost in the state of Utah for special ed. We have groups out there, investors, that want to identify these children by household income, as well as by the review or the evaluation of the student to determine that they're at risk. They know only 300 to 400 words. So we know 95% certain that this student or this child will need special education dollars. We have interested parties out there. Goldman Sachs was mentioned. They're part of this. They will come in and invest in quality preschool through curriculum in our school districts, private daycares or preschools, private So if you have your child going to a private daycare right now, and you like the people that you're working with, and this is an environment your child's used to, there are those that would invest in those facilities and get those up to a standard, high quality standard. And then we also have a home-based model for pre-K. It's called Upstart in the state of Utah. So if you're lucky enough to even be at home, we don't want to interrupt where the child's at necessarily, but we have a way to have investors that would pay for that curriculum or that experience even in the home. You ask yourself, why would people want to invest in preschool? And what the state of Utah has agreed to do is we're saying, look, if we know that child was going to cost a certain amount, let the child go through, and I can talk in detail about how we have an independent evaluator. We have a board that chooses this. This is all done third party to make sure that the descriptions I'm sharing are actually accurate. But if that child enters our schools and does not require an individual education plan, there's a portion that is repaid back to that investor every year. And it's a simple yardstick. Do they need an IEP or not? We don't have to give them any additional tests. There doesn't have to be anything else involved. If at any point that child ever needs special education, the state of Utah doesn't reimburse for the quality pre-K of that student. Now, you ask yourself, this is also a very transient or a population that will move anywhere. You could have someone that an investor came in and invested in this child, and within a matter of years, they moved away. And if you move away, there's no reimbursement either. And so people would say when we were passing the bill, who in the world would invest in something like this? It doesn't sound like a very safe investment. I'll tell you who. Those that would have given philanthropically anyway. Foundations that already give aspirationally, trying to improve the fate of some of these students, are seeing nothing back. Any prospect at all that there is a way to regenerate those dollars and see them come back and that they can reinvest in these children is worth it. And so it's not a great return. It's not exactly your blue chip stock, but there is definitely a market for this. There is an interest in this, and we're seeing not just the taxpayer. If I was going to pay as a state of Utah this much in special ed dollars, and you're going to take this much for us to avoid that cost, well, we're dollars ahead because we know what we would have spent. And so we have come up with a formula. It's a little bit smaller right now. We have 750 of these students that we've been able to ramp up and begin. We had a test, we had a proof of concept that happened in a school district in Utah that really validated the data for this. And with Goldman Sachs, we worked with them, or not we, but the Grant School District did. And so we've seen the success. We've ramped this up, and we know that we're going to see those finite dollars that we're just stretching and trying to spread across all the demands that we have. We believe that we are experiencing great cost avoidance, and for a state policymaker, that cost avoidance is are real dollars that we can leverage somewhere else in public education.
So I'm getting the concept, which I'm going to call special ed prevention, and that is more economical from the state standpoint and better for the kid, both. And that makes perfectly good sense. But I'm not quite understanding the financing mechanism here. While the kid is in preschool, who is paying the cost of the preschool while he's in it?
The investor.
The investor.
So the investor pays the full cost. Now, what is high-quality preschool? In the bill, there is an evaluator that would have to be, we call it the School Readiness Board. They are appointments from our state school board, our state charter school board, the Speaker of the House, the Senate President, and Workforce Services that all have an appointee, a designee on this board. They pick the evaluators that will decide what is quality preschool, or they pick the group, and it could be an institution of higher learning where they would evaluate programs and determine that they're high quality. They're also the ones that would conduct the evaluation of the students to determine if they are an at-risk child due to the valuation of that child and also the household income.
So Goldman Sachs, to stick with that example, is covering the upfront cost of the child's preschool experience.
Correct.
And it's free for the family.
Correct.
Okay. And then
and they get to opt in. There isn't any of these. This quality pre-K does not.
It's all voluntary.
You sign up and you have to agree to it proactively.
Okay, I've got all sorts of questions about how this works in the real world, but you're it sounds like in a kind of a beyond pilot phase now. You've been doing this with 750 kids so far?
Yep. So we started with a proof of concept in Granite School District, and now we are looking to bring this to scale. We're pretty optimistic. We're already seeing the interest, and it's not just, I don't want to pick on just Goldman Sachs. There are an incredible amount of interested parties. I will tell you this too, on the political side, as a state lawmaker, I will tell you that this was bipartisan. There is an overlap in this policy where people from very different, maybe cut from different political cloths, see the value in this. I have a Democrat county mayor that comes with me. I'm the heartless Republican that cares about the numbers and how the dollars are stretched, and he's the one that wants to make sure these kids are on a better trajectory. And not that we don't have overlapping interests there, but we talk about why this is bipartisan in nature and why we think it's successful public policy, because it does right by these kids. We had 16 chiefs of police that signed letters asking our legislature to do this because they knew that their job and the children that were in their jurisdictions, they want to go to school. They want to be successful. Who wants to go to a school and meet failure every day? This was changing that trajectory and doing it in a powerful way.
Interesting. Very interesting. All right, so we've had a series of examples laid out here of ways that states or districts or the federal government, if you want to go there, could do things differently in the area of financing improvement and innovation. Let's call it that in education, and also paying for effectiveness, paying for success, paying for outcomes as opposed to just paying for inputs. So I'd be interested in any more examples from the panel about essentially pay for performance as opposed to pay up front. Other examples from your own experience or from other places that you know where the money flows if the education takes effect rather than on the promise that something will be done. Senator?
Yeah, and I wanted to go back and talk about the tax credit too, because
Okay.
very successful in Florida is our corporate tax credit scholarship program.
Okay.
And while it's not necessarily a outcome then you pay situation, it is a clear situation where through that tax credit we're giving other opportunity and choice, and
Including the young woman that introduced Governor Bush this morning.
yes.
Yes.
So, and we expanded it last year. But again, these types of innovative legislative enactments don't come without controversy and are continuing.
Controversy?
battle. Yes. In Florida, we have a constitutional requirement to provide pre-K,
Yes.
voluntary pre-K. And just a footnote on that, we enacted it, we did the enabling legislation when Governor Bush was in, and he vetoed it the first time because we needed, and he wanted, rightfully so, to set up a system that was truly outcome-based, even in that constitutional requirement. And so when we went back in, we made sure that it was not just a daycare, but actually providing outcomes.
With a kindergarten readiness assessment, if I remember the Florida program
Right.
correctly.
Correct.
And the reporting back to the preschool provider how their graduates, so to speak, did when they got to kindergarten.
Yes.
Yes.
And we often get, well, the problem is you have that break in the summer, and so they're ready to go when the school year ends, but then they lose it over the summer, which, that's one of many arguments that we have to deal with in that program.
The one time I looked at this, update us all on this, the ineffective preschool providers did not necessarily get thrown out of the program. They got the data on their ineffectiveness, but they stuck in the program. Has that been taken care of?
That's correct, and it's and I sound like the biggest Bush fan up here, but I am from Florida. It gave them an opportunity to measure, to see their results, and to measure against themselves. And as to quote Bush, if you don't measure, you don't care.
Right. But in terms of their continuation as a preschool provider with the state of Florida paying for it, they would continue nevertheless.
Correct.
Okay, so that's not a perfect outcomes-based system. It's 2/3 of the way toward one.
Right, and that's why I let in with it. It's not, exactly a pay if you get the outcome.
Got it. Okay, good. Additional examples. Ian, I think you would, and I'll come back to you, Tom, in a sec. On the pay-for-performance version of this in education this time.
Yeah, so actually, I'm just going to build on what Greg said, and he was being modest because I think that what he's describing, what Utah is doing, is absolutely going to transform the social sector as we know it, which of course includes education. And what he's alluding to, and the example of it in Utah is something called a social impact bond. Some of you may have heard of that.
But explain it a little, because not everybody knows how that works.
Yeah, so it's the worst named policy tool in the history of policy
Social
tools.
impact bond.
Yeah, so social impact bonds are not bonds. They're actually just
And they
loans.
may or may not have an impact, so
May
keep
not
going.
have an impact, and it may not be social, but other than that, yeah, it's spot on. So I'm gonna distance myself from that term and talk more about pay for success. And pay for success is this bigger toolbox that includes social impact bonds like the work that's happening in Utah. It also includes, Tom, the work I think that the X Prize has done. I noticed that you used to work at the X Prize.
X Prize, yes.
Yes. So pay for success as a concept has two sort of main components, and it doesn't have to be just education. It can be any social outcome that you find valuable as a government, usually tied to cost savings of some kind of remedial cost that's no longer necessary. So pay for success, one, is a contract between a government and a service provider. That service provider can be a nonprofit, it could be a social enterprise, it could be a for-profit, it could be a school district, where basically you outline exactly what it is that you're trying to produce. Is it graduating 100% of your students? Is it closing the achievement gap? Is it reducing recidivism? Is it reducing childhood obesity? Whatever it is. You establish what that outcome is, you enter into a contract with government, government stipulates in advance how much that outcome is worth to them after some period of time, and then on the basis of that financial commitment, the service provider is able to raise working capital investment, that's that loan, from investors. That could be Goldman Sachs, it could be a philanthropist, it could be an impact investor, but the key here is that the investor is taking on the risk that the program may not produce the results. So if you think about what government usually does, is we put an RFP out for solving a problem. A bunch of people send in applications. We pick the best one based on the metrics that we have available to us. And then we hope that the program produces an outcome that's valuable to us. This flips that model on its head and says, this is the outcome that is valuable to us. This is how much we're willing to pay for it. You go figure out how to do it, and you go figure out how to finance it. So that's pay for success kind of in a nutshell. And I would say I know I'm going long here, but it solves a really fundamental problem for government. Present company excluded, of course, most policymakers are risk averse. They're not going to want to invest in an upstream program necessarily that's going to save them money down the road unless they can be guaranteed that that investment will produce the outcome that they care about. Because the risk here is that you fund a prevention project, whatever it is, and it doesn't work. So you've paid for the prevention, and now you still have to remediate the problem. So you still have to pay for that remediation. So double paying is a terrifying prospect for most public officials. The beauty of pay for success, because of that performance-based contract, is it basically is a money-back guarantee. If you don't deliver the outcome that's valuable to me, that saves me money as government, I don't have to pay for it. And that gets us out of this box where we know investing in pre-K reduces special education, but we can't, as policymakers, bring ourselves to fund it universally because of that risk that it may not actually work.
Excuse me, has anybody in the back of the room got control of the sound system and deal with the interference that we're getting out of the speakers? If so, please do. Are you done?
I'm done.
Who audits the result to offset the temptation to cheat on the result?
Yeah, so the fraud potential here, of course, is significant for all the parties involved.
I'm going to pay you to get them from third grade into fourth grade. So,
Yeah.
well, we'll just promote them.
Everybody has a stake to fudge the data. So it's really important that there's an independent auditor, as is the case in Utah and elsewhere, who will come in, usually actually measured against a control group. So there's actually a running randomized control experiment going on between the kids or the target population, whatever it is, versus a similar target population that did not receive the service. And then based on that comparison, the success payment is made. So there's an independent auditor. There's usually some kind of experimental design to the analysis that proves that it was the intervention itself at some high degree of confidence, the intervention that moved the dial for that particular population on the outcome that you're contracted to deliver.
Yes, please.
How many lawmakers do we have?
Admit it.
Good. I know it's hard to. I just want to tell you, because this is a critical part of what we're talking. This program has to be independently evaluated, and what we're talking about in cost avoidance has to be real. So when I was drafting this bill, there was a provision in the bill where the investors, or those that were looking at this bill from the investors' side of it, wanted our independent school readiness board to agree to an evaluator with the investors. And I rejected that. I would not allow that to be in the bill. And people said, well, how can the investor be sure that it's not gamed against them? And my answer to that is then don't invest. Because the only thing we're interested in the state of Utah is creating opportunities. We're not driving the outcome. We want to create an atmosphere where investors can invest if they think it's a reasonable place to put those dollars. We want to have evaluators where we are not worried that those assessments could be gamed, maybe pointing to more children needing this intervention than maybe would.
Or less needy kids, which was the other thought going through my mind, is cherry picking the kids for the program.
Exactly. So you have to have that assessment be absolutely valid. And the way the bill that we passed does that is that there's the School Readiness Board, which has no dog in the fight other than what they've been appointed to do, picks this independent evaluator. That evaluator will evaluate those children. But then once they enter the public schools, there's not any other evaluation that needs to happen. There's just a yes or no question at the end of the year. And those that would answer that question don't have a financial motivation about whether it's yes or no. It's not their dollars that we're either going to take or award. So whether they're in special ed or not, or they have an individual education plan, it's an easy question. And it's not subjective. So that construct of how you get those evaluators is for legislators out there. If you're looking at something like that, that has got to be absolutely pure, and you've got to make sure it's independent.
So, 1 second, Tom. Before Tom speaks, the minute-to-minute agenda that we were given says that a minute and a half ago I should have opened the floor to all of you. So, when he's done, we're opening the floor. So, be ready if you have questions.
Well, I mentioned Florida earlier as an example in online learning of paying for completion. I think it's fair to say Utah adopted that model. Was that HB 65? Also adopted the pay for completion model. So there are some good examples of that. More broadly, let's not forget that charters, at least in concept, are a performance contracting mechanism that are in effect buying a set of outcomes, and if you don't achieve those outcomes, your contract shouldn't get renewed. Some of us think that sort of a performance contracting system could be used for all public schools and public providers as the basic accountability system for K-12 and for higher ed. We mention that in this lovely new book called Smart Cities. It's available right outside the door.
They're not.
But we think that sort of performance contracting could be the basis for how states buy a set of outcomes.
Correct. That is the theory behind charter schools, and it is to
Not
some
always in
extent.
practice, right?
Practice is not perfect. At my organization's a charter authorizer in Ohio, and we have agonized over.
You and I co-funded
Yes.
a foray into multiple authorizers, and that didn't work quite as well as we had hoped.
Well, there's such a thing as too many authorizers, with the wrong incentives for themselves. But yes, the theory behind let's say a portfolio district also is that somebody is given the contract to operate a school for a period of time, and they're supposed to deliver results, or they don't get to keep operating it. Of course, those are all fraught with the obvious difficulties of, that come with closing a school or putting kids on the street or any of the other things that come with adverse action against the school. But yes, a good reminder. And in a country with 6,000 charter schools, it's definitely worth remembering. Yes?
Right.
Yeah, I was saying, but there are examples where it has worked.
Where it has worked.
Yes, and we had one in my school district.
And
And there was a lot of gnashing of teeth and worried about where these young people were going to go, but to the district's credit, they held up the commitments that were in that contract.
A very interesting, smart person was saying to me the other evening when we were talking about this very problem, that if you've got enough options in your community, the kids are likely to have better places to go, not just worse places to go. And that this may be something where sufficient scale of school options actually helps to solve that problem.
Right.
If there's one charter school and all the other alternatives are lousy district schools, then closing down that one charter school is a heavy lift. Okay, we have a mic here, and we have a mic here, and at the mic here we have someone standing. So who are you?
Georgia State Senate.
Georgia State Senate. Go ahead.
And I had a quick question. Appreciate it.
I don't know if that's on. No, doesn't feel on. Sound on.
We can hear you, though.
Okay, speak loud. Lee.
Hunter Hill, Georgia State Senate. I appreciated Ian Galloway's comments on the financing of schools related to tax credit, low-income tax credit. I feel like that the low-income tax credit is very objective in the sense that it's, rent payments tied to probably the poverty index or something like that. And that's very objective, so how do you make the subjective rankings of closing the achievement gap, I think you mentioned, can we make that objective as well? And that's sort of the line of my question.
When you don't have a clear metric like income.
Correct.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question, and I guess I would say that every community, every school district, every state is going to have a different set of objectives. Sort of, it's going to value different things. And what I like about the low-income housing tax credit and pay-for-success financing contracts that basically mimic the low-income housing tax credit, that's my big reveal, is that LIHTC was the first pay-for-success example. What I like about it is that it allows the payer, and that payer can be the state, the awardee of the tax credits, to establish what is important to them. And it can be tied to a test score, it could be tied to closing an achievement gap, it could be tied to something a little bit more subjective, as long as everybody agrees on who's going to be making the determination. It says, I'm willing to pay this amount of money for this outcome as defined. It's obviously a lot easier if it's a binary measure, like did you or did you not utilize special education, but it could be more complex, it could be more nuanced. As long as the payer, which could be again, the state allocated tax credit or a county entering into a pay-for-success contract, as long as they are comfortable with the value of the outcome and how it's defined and are willing to pay for that, then I think we could probably have this conversation a million times, and in every single circumstance, that set of outcomes is going to be different depending upon the payer. But the point is the mechanism empowers local government officials to define what's important and how much it's worth. And it's really up to you. It's really up to your stakeholders to decide what is the outcome, how do we define it, how do we measure it, and how much are we willing to pay for it. So I'm not qualified to answer that question for your particular community, but I can say the financing mechanism is flexible enough to allow for any number of outcomes to be paid for at the end of the contract.
Go ahead, sure. And then go ahead with your question
So
after
the
you.
low-income housing tax credit measures area median income or a percentage of. We look at a similarity in public education is Title I dollars. Look at the household level of poverty, free and reduced lunch. What the bill that we ran did was we took that free and reduced lunch standard, which is a household income, and we also added on top of that the context of the evaluations, where you start to evaluate the student at whatever stage, and you know that there are inherent costs given whatever that evaluation provides. So you go with, so for us, we went with household income, and that's what LIHTC does. It does the AMI, the percentage of the area median income. And you can float that. I mean, you could make it, it doesn't have to be at a certain level. But I would add that to that, the context of the evaluations of those students as well, so that the funding or the reimbursement really does follow that child or that student. So you're not getting caught up in percentages and aggregates where you start to lose that. On the point of data and the information in these evaluations, I want to point out too that some of the concerns about the bill was privacy and some of this information. The evaluators always have it, the investors never do. The School Readiness Board never sees those numbers or what the specific data is. So we know who those students are, but you have to, when you craft a bill like this, be very sensitive of some of those things like data, like information, those evaluations, and make sure you have firewalls in terms of how that's shared.
So wait. On this privacy question, which is very important, they don't see the data, or they don't see the name of the kid attached to the data.
Well, they'll see the decision makers or investors will see the aggregate.
Yeah.
They'll see the number of students. They'll see who, but they won't know who the student is, and they won't know the specifics of that one that's evaluated. But they will know that there are these many students in this school that they're
Okay.
investing, and their performance is what it's based on. But they don't know the name of the child. They don't know the specific score. The evaluator is privy to that. But
So it's at the aggregate level, at the school level, if I'm hearing you right. The information that they get is aggregated at the school level.
It's aggregated to the evaluator will determine the students that are at risk.
Okay.
And then that is really the payback mechanism. And that student's name and that student's information is not shared with the School Readiness
Okay.
Board or the investor. They just know they have students there whose success is dependent on the
Yes, sir.
payment.
Hi, Captain Ed Davidson on the school board in the Florida Keys.
From where?
Florida Keys.
Florida Keys.
Yeah.
Okay, Captain.
Everybody should come visit.
Well, a lot of people have.
Bring your credit card. Bring your credit card and support our sales tax, which pays part of our school budget.
Offer me some key lime pie. But
You bet.
go ahead. What's on
Okay.
What's on your mind?
6 of our 19 schools are charter schools. In addition, we have 2 faith-based religious schools and 1 totally private school. In order to compare results, we have to have the same kind measurement metrics, and that's statewide not really the case. These are a lot of exciting alternatives, but surely we have to have a level playing field with the same measurement metrics in order to tell which systems may have some virtues, which innovations might produce hopeful results. How would you guys ensure that happens? Because in many places, not just in Florida, that's a challenge. You're comparing apples and oranges. If you cherry pick the demographic, a word that gentleman already used, it's not a fair comparison. And if you don't measure by the same instruments. Diversity is wonderful. We have a lot of it, but I want to take the handcuffs off the traditional public schools as well, and let them really compete.
Okay.
But we got to measure by the same metrics.
So
How do you do that?
This has been a theme issue all day, actually, in different sessions. It's the sort of accountability, autonomy trade-off. It's the level playing field question, particularly challenging when you get into private school choice of one kind or another. How do you have comparable metrics? How have you worked that out so far in Florida, since that gentleman is from your state?
Well, and that remains, I think, can you hear me on this mic now? Yeah, good. Wow.
Yes, we can hear you.
That remains a challenge still in the state of Florida. You know, we went into the FCAT system years ago and started assigning the school grades, and that was our measuring mechanism. We have recently gone through a transition where we're now using the American Institute of Research test that is now going into our public schools, the AIR test, if you will. But
Keep going.
But if you look at what's going on in the state of Florida, we're actually up against a larger backdrop with Common Core. And that has led to one of our districts, schools, Lee County, I believe it was, actually having a vote to say that we as a district are not even going to participate in the assessments again. So, you know, that was quite an interesting 24 hours for us, but they changed their minds quite rapidly. But the idea is that there's a discomfort presently in the state of Florida, as you have identified, in what tools we're using, how we're measuring, and so we haven't really even gotten to that second level of trying to make sure that we're measuring equally across the board. And then when you take programs like the tax credit scholarship programs or other choice programs, there's that constant tug where one group is wanting to bring these standardized assessment tools into those private settings.
So let me ask you, as a state senator, do you feel like you have enough information about the effectiveness of the tax credit scholarship program?
I think that we feel like there's more information that we can gather. That's why the bill last year included a very aggressive set of accountability measures. It didn't include bringing the assessment into the private setting.
But other metrics?
Other accountabilities and oversight, and established a monitoring entity, if you will, at Florida State University.
Okay, Tom, then you.
Quick comment about how this will work in the future.
Yes,
I think
please.
My friend Giselle Huff and I are confident that blended schools know every day for every kid in every subject how they're doing, and that a week-long test at the end of the year is kind of silly. What I think we'll soon be able to create are comparable growth and proficiency measures verified by sampling, something like NAEP. So that schools that use different measurement systems will be able to provide comparable data, and then that data will be verified by common outside metrics, perhaps, sampling. So I think
On a frequent basis.
on a very frequent
Yeah.
basis. So I think in the not too distant future, we'll have much better answers to this question.
Good. We need much better answers, I think, because this has been an agony everywhere in the country, actually. Go ahead. Try it.
Is this on? Okay. Hi, Dale Frost from the Arizona Governor's Office. My question is more for Greg, but for whoever. I'm just curious about, as you're having conversations with your colleagues, kind of next steps to use this. Are you thinking about some K-12 application with post-secondary outcomes or post-secondary with workforce type outcomes? Just be curious to hear your thoughts.
In other words, where are they going beyond where they've already been?
So we just passed this bill last session, and we're talking about the mechanics of this bill, and even when we talk about standards, when you raise rigor, that means that every school you've just measured before is going down, okay? And the politics of that is that parents and communities are not thrilled that the legislature just told that their school is lower or not performing at an adequate level, and so we're all waiting for that end outcome where we've raised these standards and we've raised student performance. But when you implement this stuff, there's a lot of people that are not comfortable with what you've just done. These are hard political lifts. In the case of this pay for performance, I hate social impact bonds. I don't know why that is the way this is described. I think it's to bring the Democrats along. Am I allowed to say that? All right. Oh, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding.
You think Democrats thought up that phrase?
No, I don't know. I'm just kidding. So, but what I'm saying is that this bill, while it was bipartisan in nature, that meant the good news is it was bipartisan. We also had bipartisan opposition. There were people that really didn't like parts of this bill. Before we get to the stage where, because I'm absolutely convinced, as has been said, if you can avoid costs in government and you can identify it and you know that your measuring stick is accurate, we can go into prison recidivism. We can go all over the place where we can save taxpayer dollars and increase performance. But we need the time right now. This 750 will grow to 4,000. We're going to have to show. We're in the beginning stages where we're doing something different. People are asking questions. We know that our test pilot worked, but we're going to get there. But in the state of Utah, we're going to see this flourish. We're going to see this work. And then we can start to see some of the other areas of government or in public education where we can apply this. But I'll tell you, there is an incredible interest in this effort and how we're doing this and how we're capturing the cost avoidance and putting the risk on someone else.
So Utah and Arizona can talk offline as well, and you should do that. So I'm beginning to get the evil eye from management about we only have 10 minutes left. So let's do this. There are three people standing up wanting to ask questions. Are you wanting to? Okay, so let's get all three questions asked now, and then let's see if we can help with some answers. Your turn.
All right, I'll continue with the Arizona theme. Reginald Boding, Arizona House. My question is to Greg, specifically regarding the ROI. Was that written in the legislation, or is the administrator actually determining what that rate of return is going to be? And also, what is the year length that we're looking at? Because as you're talking about preschool, we're talking about individuals from K-12, that's a long time. So what does that investment look like?
So jot those down and wait to answer. And if you don't get a full answer, get him offline when we close down. Next.
So I appreciate the discussion about creative financing mechanisms. My question is, how do we more efficiently use the funds that we spend now?
Who are you?
I'm sorry. I'm Pete Miller with the Indiana State Senate.
Indiana State Senate.
So what we did in Indiana back in 2006, we passed a law. So we're just going to measure how many dollars you go to the classroom. It's about 61 cents. We figured, the sunshine will magically make this number go to the 65% benchmark. Instead, it's gone the other way. So now we're at 57 cents instead of. So how do we help drive more dollars to the classroom?
Good. And you?
Hi, a question to Kelly Stardust from the Florida Senate. One is to answer your original question of the dollar that goes for the AP. It's basically $50, but then we also give incentives if that student came from a D or an F school, that type of thing. So we also are incentivizing AP instruction in those lower performing schools. The question I have, though, is kind of along the lines of what you had also addressed earlier with regards to the preschool. I've taken the notion that giving out the information of where a school is and where they're performing, then a parent can make that choice. And kind of how enterprise works, if the school's not doing well,
the market will solve the problem.
Parents won't choose it. What do you guys feel as far as using that as a measure, as well as, we'll give you the data, we'll let you know how your schools and how your dollars are operating, then let the parents be able to make that choice of what lives and what dies?
So to oversimplify, we have a very specific question about the Utah program. We have a broad question about how do you drive more money to the classroom, and we have a broad question about is the market a satisfactory mechanism, or what's its role in this? So let's take it from the top. Actually, let's start with Greg, because you were asked a specific question, then come down this way, and then we're done.
Great question on return on investment. So this whole effort is housed out of our Governor's Office of Planning and Budget. We needed someone that had the financial acumen to actually go through the kind of negotiations. So the return on investment is actually a negotiated amount. We've capped it. We've capped how much that return can be, but we'll allow for the demand and those that are interested to really drive what that return on investment will be. The length, that can vary as well. But what the standard was and what the pilot was till 6th grade. There was a portion paid back until the student had completed the 6th grade. And that's a great measurement, because you've gotten past that kind of that 3rd grade crossroads where you need to be past 3rd grade at reading level to continue to learn and escape kind of the special ed trap that some of our students find themselves in. So 6 years, K through 6, is usually the time. And I think our cap return on investment was 6%. But we expect that number to go down as the demand for and there is, by the way, there is great interest in investing in this. As a raw investor, you'd go, why? But really, any kind of investment where you can regenerate dollars that you're spending otherwise is highly attractive to many organizations and entities.
Good. So I think you have the makings of an Arizona-Utah summit coming up on education pay for performance. Okay, Ian?
Yeah, I just actually want to follow that comment coming from a slightly different direction. I don't think the object necessarily should be to get that rate of return down. I think we should see this pay for success, social impact bond, whatever you want to call it, approach as a way to surface innovation. And sometimes innovation is risky and is not going to happen for a 5% rate of return, but could happen for a 15% rate of return or a 20% rate of return. And there are opportunities, there are programs that are incredibly expensive and largely avoidable. Keeping somebody out of prison, for example. Improving birth outcomes for low-income mothers, for example. You're talking about tens of thousands, in some cases hundreds of thousands of dollars per person who avoids that service. And when you have that kind of savings at the government level, and the intervention is relatively cheap, a couple $1,000, $10,000, there's a huge margin there to pay an investor for taking on the risk for investing in a program that produces those cost savings and improved outcomes. So I would just say that right now, as we prove the concept, it's absolutely appropriate to keep those returns relatively low and to focus on sort of evidence-based programs that have a track record of success. But eventually, if this is truly a marketplace for social outcomes or educational outcomes, then you could potentially see significant returns and attracting significant institutional investors to the table who currently are not interested in 5% rates of return, but could be for 20 or 30% rates of return someday down the road.
There's meat here for further discussion, as high rates of return in public sector enterprises also cause some people to get very queasy about them. Senator?
Yes, and I'm going to touch on a little bit about what Senator Stargell touched on, and she's my go-to person, frankly, in the Florida Senate.
She looks very competent.
She's very competent, much more than me. I think the market does play a role, but we're very afraid politically to get into that discussion. But it should. The only way performance funding is ultimately going to work is if the stakeholders are involved in the process. I mean, because ultimately that's who it is. It's the students, it's the parents, it's also the teachers and the administrators. And one of the strategies that we're implementing in the state of Florida is to make sure that we are being inclusive with all the stakeholders, which actually also include the private business sector. But in terms of measuring, yes, absolutely, choice based on data by the stakeholders needs to be a factor.
Tom?
I'll close just by addressing Pete's question about dollars to the classroom. So I agree with the sentiment of trying to sunlight that issue. It was that strategy that caused me as a superintendent 20 years ago to go from the highest cost district in Washington State to the lowest cost administrative district in the state, from about 40% to less than 15%. So I think sunlight is a good thing. On the other hand, I wouldn't sweat this issue. I wouldn't sweat class size. I wouldn't sweat any input variables. I would try to advance the concept of buying outcomes. And here's a radical idea. Ditch your state's accreditation system and use performance contracting. I mean, I think that's the direction that we have to go, where states are, as all of us have talked about in one way or another, move from funding inputs to buying outcomes.
We are 2 minutes early. I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking a terrific panel.